1740s, the British Army was undermanned and under-resourced, with most of its fighting strength sucked into a war on the continent.
Ready!
The last thing its army at home needed was a major rebellion, spearheaded by an army of raging Highlanders.
Freeze!
The Jacobite Rising of 1745 brought a clash of military cultures unlike any other in British history. On the one side, the red-coated and highly regulated government forces, loyal to the ruling House of Hanover. On the other, a coalition of Scottish clans, French troops and Irish mercenaries, keen to topple the establishment and restore the exiled Stuart to the throne. While the history books have tended to focus on the leading figures and generals, and popular culture has reduced the story to a struggle between oppressed Scots and savage English occupiers, little attention has been paid to the rank-and-file troops, who bore the brunt of the suffering. In this episode, I've joined up with Pulteney's 13th Regiment of Foot and Rose and Thistle, both part of Lace Wars, plus our old friends in the Worcestershire Cavalry, to find out how tough life really was for a raw recruit in the mid-18th century. Using a range of historical sources and a little hands-on experience, we'll try to piece together what the 45 Rising looked like from the perspective of the ordinary soldiers. I'll discover how the British Army whipped enlisted men into shape.
Corporal Hughes! Why is your queue not under your hat?
How they were sustained on seemingly endless marches.
Soldiers will be allowed 6 pints of beer a day.
Wow.
What it was like to face a terrifying Highland charge.
Stand fast! Damn your eyes! Stand fast!
And just how likely it was that you'd make it out alive. The origins of the Jacobite Risings stretch back to the 17th century. Since the Catholic James II was ousted from the English throne in 1688, at least 4 attempts had been made to restore his family's fortunes, each one a fascinating story in its own right. His supporters, who took their name from the Latinised version of James, Jacobus, were chiefly centred in Scotland, from where the Stuarts originally hailed. But sympathetic Catholics in France, Spain, Ireland and even England longed to see the Stuarts back in charge, and the line of Protestant monarchs who had replaced them cast into oblivion. Their main target in 1745 was George II, a German speaker who much preferred his native Hanover to England, something which did little to enamour his subjects. But he was a competent military man, and was the last British sovereign to fight alongside his soldiers at the Battle of Dettingen against the French. George oversaw an army in a state of transition, slowly evolving into the highly disciplined Redcoat force of later conflicts, but still weighed down with some of the traditions and tactics of the previous century.
3 cheers for His Majesty the King. Hip hip! Huzzah! Hip hip! Huzzah!
New standardisation for uniforms and equipment had been laid down by the King in 1742, for example, but regiments still bore the name of colonels who usually bought their commission. As we'll see, this often placed government troops in the care of incompetent officers. In any case, with the scene set for the last great Jacobite rebellion, Britain's best units were busily engaged on the continent, and those posted in Scotland had no idea what was about to hit them.
Shoulder your bayonets. Order your bayonets.
Excuse me, sir. Hi there. I've just turned up for my first day in King George's army.
A new recruit, splendid.
A new recruit. On the eve of the 45 rebellion, where are recruits like me generally coming from?
all over Britain, really. All through the year, a lot of the regular line infantry regiments recruit across the country. They send out recruiting parties formed of a subaltern, a junior officer, perhaps an NCO, and a drummer to drum up support. They'll visit popular recruiting grounds. The best time for recruits is sort of in the winter, early winter, just after the harvest. So you've perhaps got a lot of young men unemployed. They would go round the country, Scotland, England, Ireland for the Irish establishment, for the troops stationed there, and they would want to recruit good young men with good teeth for biting cartridges.
Okay. Just about
got all your
right.
teeth?
Yeah, just
Good,
about
good,
okay
good.
for that.
What they don't want is the dregs of society. In wartime, when recruiting is really going strong and we're struggling for recruits, recruiting parties might contact local JPs, magistrates, and people who were in debt and facing debtors' prison. They might be given the choice. Even such civilians who'd done really bad crimes, and they may escape the noose by being drafted into the army, recruited into the army. But the army really didn't want those sorts of people. They wanted volunteers, people who really wanted to be there. It was a volunteer army generally, as opposed to the continental armies like France, who were conscription across the board.
And if we were at a camp in Scotland, for example, most of your recruits, they're not English occupiers, right? They are Scottish.
We are the British Army, yes. It's not England versus Scotland at this period. We are the British Army. We've Britain since 1707, the Act of Union, under Queen Anne's reign. We're now 1740s, so under King George II. But yes, we are the British Army, and we will recruit Scots, English, Irish, but not Catholics.
Okay, I see. Because as we're going to find out soon, those Catholics are going to be causing us some problems, right, in the British Army?
Indeed, indeed. Though there were Protestants in the Jacobite army as well.
Okay, interesting.
And there were English in the Jacobite army.
Yeah,
as well.
of course. So it's not the lines aren't quite as black and white as perhaps it's been portrayed at certain points. So the government army in Scotland in 1745, is it a particularly big force at that point, or are there other things going on that perhaps is distracting the British army at that time?
The majority of the British army is engaged on the continent in Europe, in Flanders, Belgium, fighting in the War of Austrian Succession. That is the big war that has kicked off in the 1730s, end of the 1730s too. We are fighting the French, the Spanish, we're allied with the Austrians and the Dutch. The troops that are left at home in Britain are fairly green, especially up in Scotland, and especially the dragoons. The 13th and 14th dragoons, Gardeners and Hamiltons, were quite green. General Cope, who is in command of North Britain, as it's called at the time, his command was mainly based in Edinburgh. Though he'd got troops stationed in Inverness, in Fort William, in various little forts. Don't forget, this is the next Jacobite rebellion. There has been previous Jacobite rebellions at the beginning of the century. So General Wade has started to build roads around Scotland, really to make it easier for troops to move between places.
The sophisticated network of forts and military roads crisscrossing the Highlands may well have convinced government recruits that they were invulnerable to localised uprisings. On the face of it, they were also far better equipped than any clansman with Jacobite sympathies. The Disarming Act of 1715 had outlawed ownership of swords, pistols, muskets, or any other warlike weapon in many areas of the Highlands.
And so, Rob, perhaps let's talk about the kit that is issued to these new recruits. I'm feeling pretty heavily laden. That would be the first thing that I would say. Can we talk through what I'm wearing?
We can. So the main clothing of a British soldier at this point is the famous Redcoat. It's a red greatcoat, double-breasted. You've got lapels here. It's made of broadcloth. quite thick and heavy.
It's thick and heavy, all right, yeah.
Which is hot on a day like this, and in bad hot climates, but it keeps you dry and keeps you warm in the colder weather. And in inclement weather, you can unbutton the lapels and fold them across. The skirts here are hooked up to show the facing colours, so you can unhook them and they fold across to protect the upper thigh.
I see. So some consideration for fashion and some for practicalities, I'm guessing. Quite useful in Scotland.
Yeah, definitely. The cuffs can be folded down over your hands to keep your hands warm and dry on when you're on sentry. And per mess, for every sort of 6 men, there would be a massive heavy greatcoat issued, like a watch coat, and that would be issued for really wet, damp, cold nights on sentry duty, because only one person out of a mess would be on sentry at any one time.
Got it. I'm sure they were fighting over that
at night,
in the winter
in
of
the
1745,
tents,
perhaps. One thing I've got to ask, Rob, sometimes in popular culture we might see everyone's wearing one of these periwigs, including private soldiers. That's not the case, right? Those are just for officers.
No. The upper classes would wear wigs, or they would style their own hair. It's a bit more hygienic to wear a wig. They would perhaps shave their own head and wear a wig. For the private soldiers, they would generally style their own hair, not with the curls perhaps, but certainly long hair, and they would tie it back and put it in a queue, as it's called, a ponytail, and tuck it under their hat.
And otherwise, we're carrying everything that you need to survive on the march, right?
You are. As well as your coat, you've got a thick woolen waistcoat and woolen breeches. The waistcoats, we think, could have been or were often made from the waist of the previous year's coat. So you would, in theory, get a new uniform every year. And in theory, yes. Depends on where you were. If you were stuck in Antigua in the West Indies, you might not.
Yeah.
But in theory, you got a new uniform each year, or a new greatcoat. So your coat would be then made into the next year's waistcoat, which could be where the name waistcoat comes from.
Got it.
You've got canvas gaiters to protect your lower leg and to keep your shoes on as well. You've got buckled leather shoes, which can easily come off in muddy, sticky ground, so the strap under the gaiters help to keep your shoes on. We've got leatherwork, cartridge box to keep your cartridges in for your musket, waist belt for your hanger or sword, and your bayonet. And famously, the three-cornered hat.
Yes.
Cocked hat.
Yeah,
So this is civilian fashion. And whereas most of your kit is fairly practical, the hats aren't. They don't really keep the sun off or the rain off. In fact, the rain, they fill with rainwater, and when you look down, the water drips down into your pan of your musket.
That's not very helpful.
It's not, but there are records and there are some pictures shown of the men uncocking their hats. So they undo the stitches and pull the sides down. So it's just a wide-brimmed floppy hat.
Right,
and that's much better for keeping the sun and the rain off.
And I notice it's slightly pulled to the side, it's not in the centre. Is that
So it
to,
should
to
be
avoid
over
this musket?
The front part should be over your left eye, so you can shoulder your firelock without knocking your hat off.
If the hats worn by regular soldiers appeared impractical, then those donned by grenadiers appear almost comical. As their name suggests, these elite troops historically carried a satchel of grenades, and the unique headwear was to allow them to throw these unimpeded. But while grenades were probably used on the battlefield during earlier rebellions, by 1745 they tended to be reserved for siege operations. Grenadiers were nevertheless still hand-picked to set an example to the rest of the battalion, and young troops would quite literally look up to them with their tall mitre caps.
And talking of firelocks, this looks very similar to a weapon that you might be using 80 years later, right? The Brown Bess has a lot of staying power.
Indeed, it's essentially the same weapon. At this period, it's just a bit longer and perhaps slightly heavier. These are the Longland pattern Brown Besses, used from sort of Marlborough's period right through to into the Victorian era, and it gradually got short. The barrel gradually got shorter throughout the century. But yeah, smoothbore firelocks, as they were called, land pattern firelocks. They're smoothbore, so they're relatively inaccurate. They're not rifled, so they fire a small lead ball. When fired, the ball will rattle and bounce its way along the barrel and come out of the end at a slight angle. So the military doctrine of the day specified that they're fired in volleys generally, to maximise the amount of lead in the air.
So perhaps you're not aiming at a particular single target?
No, you're not aiming, you're presenting.
And these soldiers are being trained presumably to fight against armies using similar tactics, also firing volleys.
Yep. Lines of infantry opposing lines of infantry, firing volleys into each other.
Because that's what they're used to fighting against if they're on the continent, for example, but they're about to face something a little bit different.
They are, yeah. So at Preston Pans and Falkirk, and to Culloden to an extent, they faced the Highland charge. The Jacobites were issued with a lot of firearms, certainly in the later part of the war. But yeah, it was something completely different to what they'd experienced before, certainly at Preston Pans.
And it worked initially, right? It took them by surprise.
It did. Cavalry and infantry, yeah.
This episode is sponsored by War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. And you can join your first battle for free right now on PC or your favourite console. Place yourself at the wheel of an astonishing range of armoured cars, tanks and self-propelled guns, or swoop down on your enemies in iconic combat helicopters and fighter jets from the past century. History fans will love the intricate detail that goes into recreating these vehicles, right down to accurate period markings and insignia. Sophisticated modelling means that every component, from engines to fuel tanks, respond authentically to collisions and incoming fire. Together with immersive sound effects and super sharp graphics, you quickly become absorbed in the gameplay experience. You can put your survival skills to the test in 3 different player modes, each setting a different challenge depending on whether you prefer hyper-realistic, bare-bones simulation or full-throttle arcade-style action. What I really love about this game is that it's easy to dive straight into the action as a novice. You can be charging across the battlefield in your favourite combat vehicle in your first session, using nothing more than your mouse and keyboard to drive. Sure, there's plenty of room to develop your skills, and like me, you'll gradually spend less time in X-ray view, finding out how you just got blown to smithereens. So go ahead and join your first battle with a community of over 70 million players. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox using the link in the pinned comment or video description to sign up. And for a limited time, new players and those who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack on PC or consoles that includes multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account. Happy hunting! After years of uneventful garrison duty, the government troops were no doubt eager to meet the rebels and their treasonous leader head-on. Rumours had already spread that the Jacobites were led by the 24-year-old grandson of James II, Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender. He had landed on the Hebridean island of Eriskay on the 23rd of July, with 1 ship and only a handful of supporters. But some Highland chiefs had already been convinced to join him.
As news of the rebellion spread, the commander of the government forces in Scotland moved to reinforce his Highland strongholds. He sent all available men down purpose-built military roads to add to the garrison at Fort William. Everything was under control, or so he thought. The first party of troops under a Captain Swettenham stopped at an inn just 12 miles north of Fort William for a dram of whiskey. They were Scotsmen after all. Unsurprisingly, they had no idea that they were being surrounded by Jacobite clansmen.
Within 48 hours, disaster befell another party of newly raised government troops on the same military road. Setting off on a gruelling 28-mile march through hostile territory, this detachment of the Royal Scots did little to impress a local eyewitness.
They marched through what might have been properly styled an enemy's country, and consequently ought to have been upon the watch by advancing a sergeant and 12 men in case of accidents. But in place of this, they marched all in a confused heap without regard to order or discipline.
At Highbridge, 20 miles into their journey, they were ambushed by a small party of MacDonald clansmen hidden in the trees. The inexperienced Redcoats started falling back, and were eventually surrounded as more Jacobites joined the fray. With 5 men killed and more than a dozen wounded by musket fire, they surrendered, without inflicting any loss on their enemy.
The soldiers captured during these encounters ended up being spectators to a significant moment in history, the raising of the Jacobite standard at Glenfinnan.
Seamus read the bar!
Even as hostilities intensified, at this early stage of the war, prisoners appear to have been treated reasonably well. The commanding officer captured at Highbridge, for example, was tended as a house guest by the MacDonalds and sent on to Fort William to receive medical treatment. The young Charles Stuart, with pretensions of ruling over all subjects of the United Kingdom, would have been conscious of the propaganda value of treating his enemy charitably, and the consequences if he didn't. It should also be remembered that Scottish clans and government soldiers weren't always on bad terms. The Black Watch was a British Army regiment recruited in the Highlands that had served with distinction at the Battle of Fontenoy on the continent. Apparently seen as no threat to the Jacobite cause myself, I was also free to gather my things and rejoin my unit. But before heading back, I was keen to gain some more intel on the enemy's strength.
So Todd, I've risked coming to meet the Jacobite leader. Can you tell us a little bit about your camp setup? Is this a marching camp that you're in?
So our camp's quite different to the Redcoats in the fact that the Jacobites were mostly civilians before they joined the Jacobite army. So usually we would have been set up in a village or a town. We wouldn't have had tents at all. We would have taken over a village, slept in the barns, the houses, the pubs, the inns, or wherever else it would be. So this is just a representation really of what they would have had.
Okay, and the Jacobites, they're not wearing uniforms in the same way that the Redcoats are. How are you distinguishing yourselves? Is it by the tartan? Is it by the cockades on your hat? What is it?
Well, it's a bit of both really, because initially the Jacobites were all Highlanders. When Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his father's colour at Glenfinnan, they were all wearing tartan, so you could recognise Jacobites by that. But by the time they'd moved down into Edinburgh, a little bit later in the war, you've got a lot of Lowlanders had joined, and Lowlanders dressed the same as everybody else. They're just the same as the English, the Welsh, the Irish. It's just civilian wear. So then you might start seeing people wearing the cockade in their hat, or even maybe a tartan sash to show that they were loyal to the Jacobite cause.
Is it fair to say that the Jacobite army isn't necessarily that unified? There's different groups, as you mentioned. There's Highlanders and Lowlanders who are probably quite suspicious of each other. They might be bonded by the desire to see the Stuarts back on the throne, but otherwise it's quite a different looking bunch, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if you looked at the Jacobite army as a whole, they look different. You've got people who are wearing different clothes. So you've got your Highlanders wearing your typical Highlander clothing with what we'd call a kilt in the modern world. They wouldn't call it a kilt then, but with the tartan, the typical Highland dress. And then you've got people who are dressed in Lowland clothing, which is very similar to your uniform in a way, other than the fact that you're wearing red, of course. And then you've got the people that had come over from France. So you've got the Irish and the Scots descendants who were actually wearing uniforms, and some of those regiments were actually wearing red. So they looked different, and they were armed differently as well.
Got it. So let's talk about the arms a little bit. There is something of a clear distinction, at least in terms of tactics, between what the Redcoats are doing and what the Jacobites are doing.
Yeah, so initially the Jacobites weren't very well armed because there'd been Jacobite risings at the end of the 17th century and earlier in the 18th century. Guns to a large extent were illegal for most people, and swords and things like that, so they weren't meant to have weapons. That didn't mean to say they didn't hide them, of course. So when they first fought at Preston Pans, a lot of the Jacobites were armed with very, very old guns. We've got descriptions saying they were held together with string or rope. They were carrying large farm implements and lock arbor axes, which is a particular style of axe, and really, really not very many swords. You know, the image of the Highlander with his big sword and this sort of thing is really a bit of a myth.
So the best armed Highlanders, presumably like yourself, the leaders of the clans and their close family members, I'm guessing, what would they be carrying? What is the typical Highland battle gear?
Well, for starters, the top of the clan tree is known as the Fine. They're the people that are all related sort of to the clan chief. So somebody like that, once the army has started moving, are carrying everything. So they've got a nice basket-hilted sword like this, which gives hand protection and is a slashing weapon which will cut you in half from your shoulder to your hip in one slice if you should catch it wrong. Is a very posh version of that type of sword. It's a multi-purpose weapon to a large extent, because this edge here, this is a back sword, so it'd only be sharp from the top to here and all the way down this edge and not sharp on the back, but that's a slashing weapon. It's not a fencing weapon. So you're hacking with this. That doesn't mean to say that I wouldn't be trained, because I would. You've also got the basket hill. This makes a very, very nice knuckle duster. If you catch that in the face, you're going to go down. And of course, the objective is not to kill somebody, it's to get them on the floor and move on to the next person. So when you see things in the film of somebody stabbing somebody once they're down, they're probably going to be killed by the bloke behind them. You've also got a pommel on here. You can use that, whack somebody on the top of the head. That's where you get the expression pommeling somebody from. Again, you're going to go down on the ground. But this is basically all-round hand protection, and this is what the better people would have. So as well as that, you've got the dirk. Now, there's lots of stories about these being made out of broken swords. If you look at this blade here, it looks like the top half of a sword, and certainly there were some like that. There's all sorts of different designs. This one's actually copied from an exhibition that was at Culloden. It's got a Celtic knot design here, and of course the traditional Scottish thistle here. And traditionally what you do is you'd carry this in your left hand. Now, you wouldn't just carry your sword and your dirk, you'd have your targe on your left arm. So this is a shield. For all intents and purposes, that's for what it's for. It does not stop musket balls. If you went back and got your musket, it will not stop a musket ball. But what you do is, you hold that in your left hand. You can see the hand grip here, the arm grip, and the padding at the back. You hold that in your left hand, and what happens is, if I come up against you, this edge here can be used to disembowel you. This will deflect your bayonet, but if I bring it up under your chin, it will snap your neck. At the same time, I can push you away with it and bring my sword and cut you in half with it.
Well, this all sounded rather medieval, but I couldn't help but notice that Todd was carrying another unique weapon that didn't fit with the typical view of a backward and bloodthirsty clansman.
The other thing that the Jacobites had, the better off, is steel pistols, and these are typical to the Scots, particularly to the Highlanders. These are made in places like Doon and Glasgow. They're a fully steel pistol, and then we've actually evidence to say that the best steel to make these out of is old horse nails, because it's refined. And these are very much different. They don't have the wooden stock that you see in normal pistols, and of course they don't have the range, but the myth is that you have to actually go and touch somebody to shoot them with it. We know from firing them at ranges that's not true at all. They're a fairly effective weapon, albeit with a small bore, but that's a typical Scottish dag.
That's a very unusual looking weapon, isn't it? And I mean, with the Highland tactic being to get as close as possible, you can imagine in a sort of close press, especially because the Redcoats aren't really wearing any protection whatsoever, it's going to be deadly, right?
Absolutely. The myth is, and the story is, that what would happen is the Highlanders would go in with their muskets. They would shoot their muskets and throw them to the ground. They would then shoot their pistols and throw their pistols at the opposition. This is a really expensive piece of kit. This is not just a pistol, it's a piece of jewellery. This one's been blued, most of them were polished, and they might even have engraving on them. This one's a little bit later than the 1745 Rising. But you wouldn't go throwing that at the opposition. What you do is stick it back on your belt, draw your sword, draw your targe, and then charge in. You wouldn't throw it at somebody. It's another one of those myths from the books.
While on the topic of myths, it's fair to say that the Jacobite rebellion, like the earlier Scottish wars of independence, have taken on a romanticism that distorts our views of these conflicts. Many aspects of today's distinctive Scottish culture would have been alien to the clansmen of 1745.
Sometimes people might see this period as being the genesis of the typical Scottish traditional dress we might think of today, with the kilt, the sporran, the family tartans. Is that a myth? Are those kind of things something that comes in later?
Absolutely. We can't really say that there was any clan tartans during the 18th century, particularly in the time of the Jacobite Risings. Certainly there would have been regional tartans, but there wasn't any clan tartans. It's not really until you get to the beginning of the 19th century and the re-emergence of Scottish dress, the modern kilt, the modern type of socks that people wear, the modern type of Bonnie Prince Charlie jacket, etc, etc, etc. That is, to an extent, a caricature of what they were wearing in the 18th century, and it's now become traditional. For example, people now wear the fly plaid on the shoulder, the tartan plaid. That's where you'll see our Highlanders wearing the full plaid, where it's pinned to the shoulder. And a lot of what they did in the 19th century was basically a replica of what they did in the 18th.
But bagpipes, they certainly were using those, right? That is correct for the Jacobite rebellion.
Absolutely. Bagpipes weren't an 18th century or even 17th century thing. They really go back much earlier than that. You can go back into the medieval period, and it doesn't matter whether it's in Scotland or England or even in the Far East. They were playing that sort of pipe with a bag to pump the air through the pipes to produce a sound. It's just something that Scotland adopted, and now the world knows about it all over.
By mid-September, the sound of Jacobite bagpipes could be heard dangerously close to Edinburgh. As the city fell into panic, the outfoxed British commander Sir John Cope was still far to the north, and the only government dragoons standing in the Highlanders' way mounted up and withdrew, in full view of the terrified inhabitants. The Scottish capital was taken without a shot being fired. After weeks of fruitless marching and a journey by sea down from Aberdeen, Cope's army eventually arrived to the east of Edinburgh and formed up for battle. The rank and file were uneasy after receiving a frosty welcome from the locals and hearing rumours of the Highlanders' savagery, but their general appeared full of confidence.
There is not in the whole of the ground between Edinburgh and Dunbar a better spot for both horse and foot to act upon.
After a restless night on the moor, with both armies of around 2,500 men encamped opposite each other, the government troops awoke in a state of confusion. The Jacobites had found a way to approach their position undetected, and just before daybreak appeared in front of them through the dawn mist.
When the enemy, seeing our first line in order of battle, fired an alarm gun, we did not give the English time to recover from their surprise.
The Jacobites had predicted, the mounted dragoons on the flanks of the British army fled at first contact, leaving the regiments of foot in the centre to face a devastating attack on three sides. The Highland charge had cut through the Redcoats with incredible ease.
In the chaos that followed, the infantry had it the worst. Many government soldiers literally turned their coats as they tried to surrender to the Jacobites.
The front line was miserably massacred. Such as threw down their arms and begged for quarter upon their knees were cut down inhumanely. Yea, such who fled into the enclosures were pursued and murdered. The battlefield presented a spectacle of horror, being covered with heads, legs and arms, and mutilated bodies, for the killed all fell by the sword.
As many as 500 government soldiers were slaughtered during what became known as the Battle of Preston Pans. Colonel Gardner, a lowland Scot, was among the high-profile British casualties, supposedly felled by the blow of a Lochaber axe to the head as he tried to inspire his fleeing dragoons. Panic soon spread throughout England, and after initial complacency, George II sent orders to bring reinforcements from Flanders. They couldn't arrive soon enough. In November, Charles led his forces into England and besieged Carlisle. For the moment, hopes in the north rested on the army of Marshal George Wade, the veteran of the 1715 Rising, who had overseen the construction of many of the forts and roads in Scotland. But the records of his winter campaign reveal a miserable experience for the British, Dutch and Swiss troops who served under him, as they trudged along snow-covered roads late into the night, with little food or even straw bedding to look forward to.
The government army that was shadowing the Jacobites, led by the elderly Marshal Wade, was clearly having a tough time. Wade wrote to the Duke of Cumberland that the poor soldiers from long marches and bad roads are many of them barefooted, though we've taken all pains to provide them with what shoes the country can afford. He later sent an update after the army had limped back to Newcastle, which showed why campaigning during the winter was so rare during this period. In compassion to the sufferings of the poor soldier, I have permitted the whole body of the foot to take shelter here in public halls, glass houses, malt houses, and many private houses, which has probably saved the lives of a great many of our men who were half perished by lying in camp in this rigorous season. It was hardly a letter to inspire confidence back in London.
In early December, having marched through northwest England to reach as far south as Derby, the Jacobites were only 120 miles from London. But this was as close as they'd get to the capital. With little sign of the hoped-for French invasion on the south coast, and only a small number of English volunteers joining their ranks, Charles was told that he had no choice but to regroup north of the border. The mood of the government troops, meanwhile, was much improved by the arrival of William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, as their new overall commander. The first male of the Hanoverian dynasty to be born in England, the popular Cumberland had served on HMS Victory, had been wounded in the leg at Dettingen, and had bravely led the British attack at Fontenoy. He was no stranger to battle, and he was itching for a decisive clash with the man now nicknamed Bonnie Prince Charlie.
I am so fatigued and hurt to see another town plundered before I can demolish these wretches.
As the Jacobites spun north back towards Scotland, Cumberland pushed his men hard on forced marches through weather that was, in his words, as severe as it is possible to conceive. He was eventually forced to give the infantry rest, promising each man a new pair of stockings and a pair of shoes to replace what had been worn through. Instead, it was the government dragoons, humiliated at Prestonpans, who continued in hot pursuit.
Justin, the cavalry's finally turned up. We've got some dragoons come to help us. The infantry's not doing particularly well at the moment in this rebellion. What's the role of the dragoons in this period?
Well, the dragoons are, well, they have many roles in fact. They're basically a mounted infantry. They were used for reconnaissance, scouting purposes, hit and run raids, carrying messages, things like that. They were also stationed on the flanks of the armies to obviously afford protection. And if the enemy, if there was a weakness in their line, they could be sent in quite quickly to exploit them. Similarly, if there was a weakness in their own line, they could be sent in there as well to bolster their own defences. Harass fleeing enemy. When the enemy formations broke and ran, they could chase them down. Similarly, if your own forces were retreating, they would go in there and be used as a rearguard action. So basically, they could be messengers, very versatile, a very suitable asset at the time, really.
So you're carrying a musket here, not a carbine. Is that because essentially you are going to be dismounting and firing it? The intention here in this period is not really to fire it off horseback?
No, that's correct. They would have generally have rode up to the battle or to where they were required, dismounted. It would be one man to look after the 10 horses, so the other dragoons would have got off, moved forward and acted then as regular infantry. And then they would come back mounted and ridden off. These quite often would just have been used as warning shots at the end of the day. They're not very accurate, don't have the range. And when you fire from horseback as well, you're moving, it's very difficult to get some kind of aim.
So you're also armed with a pistol there. I'm guessing you've got a sword on the side.
I do, I have a sword, yes, for close work, for close protection.
And so by the time the rebellion breaks out, the government dragoons have already got a bit of a bad reputation among the Scots, haven't they?
Well, they have, yes. There was a regiment raised in Scotland called the Black Watch, and they were recruited to serve literally within Scotland and defend Scottish borders and things like that. Then they were sent south, much to their annoyance, and there was a rebellion. About 100 or so, I think, decided to mutiny and walk home, and part of the 10th Cobhams, which is this regiment here, were sent to track them down. They did catch them. The 3 ringleaders were executed. The rest were deported or sent to serve abroad anyway with Her Majesty's forces, which is what they wanted to avoid in the first place. And so, yes, quite a reputation was built.
So quite a handy force for chasing after people, catching up with them and apprehending them, which I think is the job that you've got on your hands right now.
It is right now, yes. Due to calls, I must away. Thank you,
See
Louis.
you later.
Thank you.
The dragoons fought a small engagement with the Jacobite rearguard at Clifton Moor on the 18th of December, sometimes claimed to be the last battle fought on English soil. According to British officers, clan chiefs had been heard ordering their men to give no quarter to felled redcoats, valuable propaganda that they gobbled up. It signalled a new, pitiless phase of the conflict. But while this was little more than a skirmish, neither side had long to wait before a significant battle took place, this time on the Scottish side of the border near the town of Falkirk. Unfortunately for the government army, Cumberland had been recalled south to prepare for the feared French invasion, and their commanding officer adopted an entirely complacent attitude towards the Jacobite rabble. With driving rain and wind in their faces, the British regiments were blindly sent forward up a steep hill, from where the clansmen descended.
My heart is broke. I can't say we are quite beat today, but our left is beat and their left is beat. We had 2,000 men more than they, but such scandalous cowardice I never saw before.
In reality, the British general had been lacklustre and arrogant, inexplicably placing his dragoons in front to receive the Highland charge. Even worse, Hangman Hawley lived up to his nickname as he looked to blame the rank and file, genuinely advocating for the decimation of his troops in letters to his superiors. Though not a total disaster, around 600 government troops were killed or captured, the predictable consequence was the rapid return of the Duke of Cumberland as Commander-in-Chief. With 14 battalions now at his back, he quickly raised the siege of government-held Stirling Castle and pursued the enemy north. While in quarters in Aberdeen to see out the rest of the winter, he ceaselessly drilled his men, wasting no effort to ensure that they were prepared for the final clash.
So, postman presents fire!
One enduring myth is that Cumberland introduced a new bayonet drill, where troops would thrust to their right into the undefended flank of the charging Highlander, placing their full trust in the soldier to their left. But this tactic would never have worked in the confused press of battle, and the magazine that printed the story of the supposed innovation in April 1746 actually retracted it several months later. In reality, the officers focused on instilling confidence in their men, by showing that the reach of the bayonet was greater than that of the enemy's broadsword, as long as they stood firm. Furthermore, with money and food running out for the long-suffering Jacobites, desertion and sickness were thinning their ranks. In contrast, the government troops could rely on the Royal Navy to deliver ample supplies for their campaign.
As we go further up into the hills, our wants of bread and provision will increase. I request that 280,000 weight of biscuit and 50,000 weight of cheese, which must be sound and entire as broken ones leave great waste, could be shipped for Inverness.
After hours of marching and 18th century drill, I was keen to see what might have been on the menu for one of King George's Redcoats.
Evelyn.
Hi.
We've come to the end of a long march, and I can see my fellow soldiers have already been at the lunch options. What have we got here? Is it mostly around keeping the soldiers full rather than things that are really tasty? What's on the table?
So the soldiers will be issued with a certain amount of food from the officer, from the actual company that they're with, and then any extra they'll come to me. So I'm the sutler for the camp. I will get a licence from the officer, so I will pay him to be able to follow the camp around. But they don't really want me to follow the camp around too closely because it's a distraction for the soldiers. So I'll also, after they've had any extra provisions that I can provide, I will get them to start gambling, playing a few games and taking a few coins and getting a little bit of extra money back for myself to counter the cost of the licence to the officer.
Got it. So I'm already enjoying some small beer that you've given me here.
Yeah.
I imagine you want me to be drinking as much of this as possible.
It's
and
not
paying more money.
particularly alcoholic, the small beer. Again, the soldiers will be allowed 6 pints of beer a day.
Wow.
It's small beer. It's the first run-off in the beer brewing process. So it's just a lot safer than drinking the water of the time, really. So again, they'll get their rations and then any extra that I'll get from myself, as well as any spirits that I've got. A lot of the food will be purchased locally, so whatever you can get a hold on. A lot of the stuff would be pickles because it keeps longer. I've got pork pie here, so the crust is really thick, so that'll keep it a lot fresher. Any fruits and things that are seasonal. And then what we've got here is ammunition bread, which is what the soldiers would have.
Bread.
Yeah, ammunition bread. And it can be ammunition. If the soldiers are a little unruly, I'll give them a swipe with one of these. So it comes in at a £6 batch, and each one weighs a pound.
Wow. So I mean, that looks like a cannonball. It kind of feels like one as well. That's pretty tough.
It certainly is. You wouldn't want to get hit by one.
It's almost like a big ball of hardtack biscuit. But is it nice on the inside? What's it like?
It is. It's lovely. So I've got one slice here for you. So if you see on the inside, the crust is really quite thin. There's not a lot of it, and it's quite spongy. And what we normally have is if you spread a little bit of honey on it. And try that, it's delicious.
Nothing wrong with that. Quite dense, isn't it?
It is. So when you're making it, what you do is you would knead it, and then you would leave it for a little while, and then you would knead it again. So that's why it's so dense. But it means that the soldiers can have it in their knapsack, travel around with it, and it's not going to go to mush if it rains or it's being sort of battered about when they're on their journey.
Wow, almost waterproof bread. That is that's a good invention for the 18th century.
By chance, we know that on the morning of the Battle of Culloden, the British troops were only permitted ammunition bread for breakfast. But while I had the opportunity, I was interested in something a little tastier.
And what else have we got here? We've got some fruit pie. I mean,
yeah. So some strawberry pies. The Strawberries are the English strawberries, so they're really, really small, wild strawberries, not like your modern massive strawberries.
Oh, they're lovely. Can I try one of those? I don't think I've seen a strawberry like this in the 2024 supermarket. And we've got some beef here, Evelyn. Are you providing that, or do the soldiers already get some meat as part of their rations?
So they would get a pound of beef in that part of their daily rations, and again, any extra, they would come to me. The soldiers of the day would probably be eating around 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, but it wasn't particularly healthy. So there's a lot of fats, a lot of sugars, not too much fruit and vegetables. So again, it's very seasonal for the vegetables, so it depends what they could get as they were going along campaign.
But that's plenty of calories. I mean, 6 pints of beer is probably your daily calorie intake for today, isn't it? That's because they're marching for so many miles. That is their job essentially each day, right?
Yeah, so they would need a lot of calories to stay fit.
Nice. Well, I'm going to enjoy the rest of my beer and take as much time as I can before we get back on the march. Cheers.
With a well-fed army marching out of camp before daylight on the 16th of April, the time had finally come for the British Army to prove its mettle. Cumberland's force included 3 Scottish regiments, although interestingly, most of the government Highlanders were left to guard the baggage train. Across Culloden Moor stood a large Jacobite force, fatigued and hungry, but as fired up as ever. This time, however, the government soldiers knew exactly what was coming.
The same Highlanders who had advanced to the charge like lions, with bold, determined countenances, were in an instant seen flying like trembling cowards in the greatest disorder.
In fact, it was a testament to the power of the Highland charge, launched on this occasion without much cohesion, that it still burst through the front rank of British troops. But the clansmen faced a wall of lead that no amount of courage could stand up to. After months of forced marches, nights spent half frozen, and reverses on the battlefield, the Redcoats were out for revenge. After the battle, there was not a bayonet in this regiment, but was either bloody or bent. Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Stuart cause were defeated. Out of more than 1,000 Jacobite casualties, very few were afterwards recorded as wounded. The British, who themselves officially lost only 50 men, were ordered to show no mercy. Their leader would go down in history as Butcher Cumberland. It set a pattern for the next chapter in Scottish history, where suspected rebel sympathisers were hunted down, atrocities against the innocent were carried out, and the ancient clan system was utterly dismantled. During this period, King George's Redcoats gained a ruthless reputation that would carry through the Revolutionary War in America 30 years later. But those who had faced the Highland charge and survived would never forget it.
The poor foot left here paid for all, not in fair battle, with palder and ball, but horrid swords of dreadful length so fast came on with spite and strength. Lochaber axes and rusty scythes, dirks and daggers pricked their thighs. Thick bayonets had but little share with the long-shanked weapons there.
A big thank you to War Thunder once again for sponsoring this episode. Make sure to check out the game now for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox, and use the link in the pinned comment or video description to sign up. New and returning players who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a major bonus pack across all platforms, including multiple premium vehicles and plenty more besides. Thanks again to Pulteney's 13th Regiment of Foot, Rose and Thistle, and the Worcestershire Cavalry for making this episode possible. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like and comment on this video, and if you want to support our work, buy us a coffee at the link on the screen now.
The Jacobites charge into them with whatever they've got, because that's a very good method of. That's a very good method.
Just pick up on that. I've no idea what that was, but
I think it was a dinosaur.